just about theory and it wasn't just about the research. It was about understanding how that research and theory informs practice and helps people. That's where the humanity comes in. And the more time I spent with Dr. Wulczyn, I became more intrigued with the person that is Fred, and I knew that we needed him on the Board of Trustees here because his interest is bringing his knowledge and expertise and experience to the Juniata community so we can be better at serving our communities. And I think what you're going to hear tonight is an extension of all of his years in this place and in this space. So I'm really, really happy and glad that you get a chance to meet my boss, one of my bosses, but maybe more so my friend that is Fred Wulczyn. So we'll bring a warm Juniata welcome to Dr. Wulczyn following Dr. Bowen's introduction of his more of the credibility stuff so people can understand what you've done and brought to yours. All right, thank you.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I was going to say, pitiful. Good evening. As the president mentioned, my name is Lauren Bowen. For those of you who don't know me, I work at Juniata as the provost or the senior academic officer. And as I typically say in enrollment settings, but I will say this evening to you, I have maybe the best job in the world. And one of the reasons that getting to serve as the provost at a liberal arts college, one of the reasons it's so awesome is because my office helps to organize events like this evening, where we have the opportunity to hear from accomplished and intelligent speakers. And in so doing, one of the reasons we organize lecture series out of the Office of the Provost is because we understand that the education that we seek to provide doesn't have a whole lot of power or meaning if we can't translate it into action, and whatever kind of action that matters to us as students and as faculty and as staff and as community members. And so as the president indicated, tonight I think we're in for a special treat because Dr. Fred Wulczyn is going to talk to us about a topic you can see behind me, racial disparities in foster care, that I think will challenge us intellectually, help us understand how we ask and answer questions, how we construct knowledge, how we deconstruct it, but more importantly, what do we do with it? And so, with that, let me just share with you that Fred Wulczyn is a Juniata College alum. He graduated with degrees in psychology and sociology. He told us at dinner tonight that he was at Juniata when the social work program was being founded. So after leaving Juniata, he went on to earn a master's in social work from Marywood University, and he earned his PhD from the University of Chicago from the School of Social Service Administration. He currently works at the University of Chicago, where he is a senior research fellow at Chapin Hall. He received the James E. Flynn Prize for Research in 2011. He's been the recipient of the National Association of Public Child Welfare Administration Peter Forsyth Award for Leadership in Public Child Welfare. And in 2014, he was elected into the American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare. He is an accomplished author. He is a talented researcher. But I want to underscore and echo everything that you heard Jim Trojas say. What he brings to this conversation, I think, is a compassion and a commitment to all of us, and especially to our children. So please join me in welcoming Fred Wulczyn.
Is this working? Is it on? It's on? So, thanks for that. On the way over here, Lauren asked how I wanted to be introduced, and I really prefer name, rank, and serial number because anything more than that raises the bar of expectations for me. Now I'm a lot more nervous about how this evening is going to go. So thank you very much for that. I really do appreciate that. It matters a lot that we have an impact on the world. I learned that at Juniata. I learned how to do that, not strictly at Juniata, but the importance of why you want to have an impact, why it's important to be a good citizen, particularly in relationship to people who don't share in the blessings that many of us, if not all of us here tonight, do. Oops, that's not the way it's supposed to work. I want to thank you for being here tonight. I know it's Thursday night, I think, and you've got things that you could be doing, and so you're taking time out of your semester, your day, your week to be here and to hear what I have to say is great. Here's my clicker. So, and yeah, thanks, Lauren, for elevating the expectations. What's that?
I said I do it all the time with all these people.
Yeah. So, I'm going to talk to you about who uses foster care and what does it tell us about racial disparities in the United States. As Lauren suggested, I'm going to challenge the conventional thinking. Whether it's your conventional thinking or not, I don't know. But it is the conventional thinking out there. And based on the work that we've been able to do over the last 20 years, it depends on when you mark the starting point, we are, in a sense, challenging the orthodoxy in ways that I think are important for how we might address issues affecting families and so on and so forth. So, on with it. I like to be free-flowing. If you have questions, if I say something, make a point that you want to follow up on, this is not a script that I have to get to from beginning to end. I like a free-flowing, dynamic conversation, and so feel free to do that. You're going to hear some themes tonight that are interspersed. I want to sort of flag them ahead of time so that when I get to it, you'll recognize it as having been something that I introduced. But we have a problem in public policy in the United States that I like to call affirming the consequent. It's not my phrase. Eventually tonight I'll ask how many of you have taken symbolic logic. I wonder whether or not the college offers it at this point. You do. So if you need to take a class on symbolic logic because you'll learn about the rules of argument. And you'll learn that many of the arguments you hear are in fact not arguments. They're loosely tied together thoughts linked more to your emotions than to facts. And you need to recognize these in the course of engaging politicians, public policy makers, decision makers, what have you. An example would be, if I have COVID, I'll have a fever. I have a fever. Therefore, I have COVID. What's wrong with that? If Bill Gates owns Fort Knox, Bill Gates is rich. Bill Gates is rich. These are affirming the consequence. The consequence is used to prove the antecedent. It doesn't work that way. Give you an example. If black children are treated disparately by the child welfare system, they will have worse outcomes. They have worse outcomes. It's the same argument. And I don't raise that to suggest that there aren't issues of structural racism, bias, all of the things that you hear. I'm merely pointing out that if you want to make the point empirically, not by affirming the consequence. So I'm going to show you how that plays out today. The power of the state and child saving. I got my start in this in rural Pennsylvania, not too far from here. I grew up not too far from here. And I was telling somebody earlier today, we got called to a home, an elderly woman living in a chicken shack. As deplorable as you want to make that be in your mind is how deplorable it was. She was blind, suffering from diabetes. Gangrene was about to set in. She had open sores on her legs. And we were there to take her to the hospital. She didn't want to go. What gave us the right to supersede her sense of her well-being and what she wanted to do? What gave us the right to do that? We did, in fact, take her to the hospital because it was the humane thing to do. You couldn't leave a human being in that state of affairs. But she didn't want to go. She was where she wanted to be. Bordering on death, what have you. That's the power of the state. When I got to the University of Chicago, I realized, in a way that I hadn't ever realized before, that the state has the power to knock on somebody's door and say, we're taking your children. And there's nothing you can do about it. There'll be a process that you can engage in, but at the end of the day, if we choose to assert that power, we can assert that power and you lose your children. Maybe only for a little while, but you are essentially powerless in that situation. And this is this idea of progressive era child saving. We need to save children from the destitution of their parents. So this is a construct that animates the thinking about what's going on. Several authors in my lifetime have been very persuasive with regard to how you think about things. Arthur Stinchcomb was a sociologist. And I'm reading a book that he wrote called Constructing Social Theories. It's like, how do you actually construct a social theory? It's like there's ways to do that properly. And one of his chapters is like, how do you study power? How do you observe it in action? Because it's a construct that is, to some extent, unobservable. It exists, but how do you observe it? And his advice was, when you leave a room, turn around and look who's left. Who's left behind? Who stays after the meeting is over? And so when I worked for the New York State Department of Social Services, we would have budget meetings in August to get ready for the governor's budget. And the program people would come to the commissioner and say, this is what we're going to do this year. And I go to the first one of these things, and I heed Arthur Stinchcomb's advice. And I look around when I leave, and I see there's 2 people there left behind, in addition to the commissioner. The lawyer, general counsel, and the chief financial officer. Why? Because they were going to tell the commissioner, A, you can't do that because it's illegal, or you can't do that because you can't afford to do it. That's where the power was. So I never wanted to understand the role of money in human services. It was against my sort of idealized nature coming out of college. This was about people. It couldn't possibly be about the money. It's all about the money. All about the money. If you don't know how to talk about money, you're not in the game. You want to be in the game? Learn the finances. Because a garden that doesn't get water doesn't grow. A social program that doesn't get money doesn't grow. And the rules for dispersing revenue and how that happens is critically important to what's going on. I'll talk a little bit about how that is related to the structures that make disparate treatment of people possible. Think about who you are and who you are not. Think about who you are as a deliberate reference to the tagline that I think is still in use at Juniata. Think about who you are and who you are not. I am not an expert on racial history, relations. I have my experiences, but I'm not an expert. I know how to do some things that are interesting as it relates to, but I'm not an expert. Who am I? I'm a first-generation immigrant. I'm actually not a citizen of the United States. I've made deliberate choices to not be a citizen because it's not who I am. I was born in Germany, came to the United States shortly after the war, and if you think being a German, 10 years, think back 10 years, how vivid 10 years is in your mind now. 10 years after the war, after World War II, being a German in the United States was no picnic. We had On television in those days were television shows like Combat and Sergeant, I forget what the other one was. But the idea was that when, like kids do today, you emulate what you see on television. We would play Army in the neighborhood. And if you were playing Army in the neighborhood, what did you need? You needed a Nazi. And I was the guy who got to fulfill that role. So it was me against all of the other kids in the neighborhood. No allies. And it was hard. So, and it's taken a long time to understand sort of how that has played itself out in my life. I come from a family of colonialists on my mother's side. My mother was born in Africa, the eldest daughter of missionaries. Her grandfather was also a missionary in East Africa. They were colonialists. So we've had to deal with, as a family, what does it mean to have in your family history colonialists? We've also had to deal with how do you integrate that with the idea that there were Nazis in your family. So the process of integrating and understanding is who I am. I'm not afraid at this stage of my life to look hard and to look honestly at important social questions. What I am unwilling to do is do it on the cheap, to affirm the consequent. I want to know, through research, what's the deal. I want to raise your awareness to an important public health problem. 12% of the kids coming into out-of-home care for the first time are under the age of 30 days. In some places, 2, 3, 4% of all babies born go into foster care. People read about foster care in the press. It's stories of redemption and tragedy. But the vast middle ground is something we don't hear about ever. And that's where we have to really worry about what's happening. You told me I could take this off, right? Yeah. You will find that I'm frustrated with the political left. I'm on the left side of things. I like to think of myself as maybe the only lefty on the board of trustees. I don't know that that's entirely true, but I like that feeling, right? Jim maybe didn't know that about me, but it's true. But I'm disappointed with my colleagues on the left because they are as willing to cherry pick evidence that suits their agenda as the Republicans or the people on the right. You want to talk about, those people on the conservatives, the right, however you want to, on climate change. They just are looking at the evidence that they want to look at. They're not looking at the full scope of evidence. It's just as common on the political left. The use of evidence is, for political reasons, contaminated the discussions that are so important to actually solving our problems. And you'll hear this theme come through. My career has been a career in activism. If you talk to people, you go, he's a troublemaker. That's because I'm not afraid to do stuff that other people weren't. But my activism is expressed through research, through knowledge. That's how I want to ground activism. Not an ideology. I have values that I think are important, but it's the evidence. It's not the means that matter. It's the end. Are people better off? That's the question we have. And we have, the political discourse in this country now is, we have to do it this way because that's small government. We have to do it this way because that's big government. We don't have to do it anyway, other than the ways that solve the problems. We've become a country that owns the means, defends the means, does not defend the outcome. What are the results? I can be small. I can go for small government. I can go for big government. Let's be pragmatic. Which is the one that works? Which is the one that delivers value for people overall? And so research is how I express my activism. And then I was optimistic about this, the power of radical uncertainty. And then I looked it up on the internet and somebody has already written the book. Although it turns out that it was interesting. The bottom line is, so much of the positioning that we take, that we hear, whether or not there's as much certainty in the positions that people adopt as their verbalizations would indicate. I mean, I read an interview with a business leader, and one of the things that she said that caught my eye was, "I am always adamant, rarely certain." And people confuse adamancy and certainty. That if I am adamant, it must mean I am certain. And it only, to me, communicates that I'm prepared to defend what I'm saying, but we've now interpreted that as certainty, such that there's no way I can talk to those folks and get them to move because they're so locked in, they're so certain about their position. And so I think to advance, we need to embrace uncertainty. We need to understand that our remedies are uncertain. I can't say that, if we do this program or that program, that it's going to solve the problem of kids who need to be placed in out-of-home care. I don't know. I think there are good bets. There are bets that aren't as good. But as far as certainty is concerned, I'm not. And over the years, I've become much more comfortable with the idea. You know what? I don't really know. When I walked onto the campus of the University of Chicago for the first time as a student, I went to the library. I just learned that Juniata has a library. I didn't realize that when I was a student. But apparently it's been there for a while. In the main library, it's 2 acres, 4 million volumes. I thought to myself, man, I have some catching up to do. Because that's the cumulative output of people who write things down. And it is an imposing number. The total library system at the University of Chicago is 11 million volumes. They need more than one building to house it all. And if you think you know anything and you confront 11 million books that record what people have thought, what people have observed, literature, scientific journals, the whole 9 yards, you realize it's not possible to know everything. And so let's be a little bit more modest in our positioning. So adopting the uncertainty. Be comfortable with uncertainty. It's hard to do, but ultimately important. So, on to the heart of the matter. I'm interested in black-white differences in the use of foster care. I'm interested in Hispanics, indigenous people, Native Americans, Asians, but for this work, we're focused primarily on black and white differences. What is foster care? Foster care is something that every civilization has to figure out how to do. That is, for whatever reason, whether you're in the Amazon River Basin, East Africa, West Africa, Europe, China, there are certain circumstances where somebody will be asked to raise somebody else's children. That's what's going on. The question is, who gets to make the judgment that we need somebody else to raise somebody else's children? This is where the social judgment comes in. It's easy in the case of death. The parents are no longer there. We've got to find somebody. There's no ambiguity there. But everything else is ambiguous. And how do we solve this problem of finding enough people who are willing to raise other people's children? It's important because, forget who I said it to, except for the Shakers, we're worried about how the next generation comes into and perpetuates what's good about the way we're living as a people and eliminates what's not good. how do you weed that out? What, you know, the succession of generations. And so solving this problem, particularly when voluntary capacity is insufficient relative to demand. So in some cultures, you might get enough people through voluntary association, through extended families, people who are willing to step up and say, you know what, we'll take that job on. Temporarily, permanently, whatever the circumstance, we'll do that, and we don't need the power of the state to regulate. But as soon as that demand, the number of occasions in which that question has to be asked, who will raise this child? As soon as we don't have sufficient supply to meet the demand, somebody has to start making the decisions about how to access or allocate the limited supply. And as soon as somebody says, well, if we paid people to do it, we might get more. Now, whose money are we going to use? Because as soon as it becomes public money, it's not the Protestants taking care of Protestant kids, it's not blacks taking care of black families, it's not Jewish families taking care of Jewish families with money from that community. It's our tax dollars. Now we have a public interest in how it gets allocated. Is it being allocated fairly, or is it being allocated in a way that disadvantages some populations as opposed to others? So we have to come up with a mechanism for figuring out this problem. And then there's the issue of, okay, there are differences. How do we measure the differences? Right? And is there a theory attached to the way we measure? I will try to emphasize the importance of language. In this particular field, child welfare, foster care, you hear a lot about disproportionality. If you Google healthcare disproportionality, you won't find references unless it includes child welfare. Because disproportionality is not a word used in healthcare as much as it is in this business. And that's unfortunate. Not unfortunate that they don't use the word disproportionality, it's unfortunate that we do. Because it's a word about observation. I observe that I have a jar of marbles, filled 50% blue marbles, 50% red marbles, and I've got a smaller jar over here. And I notice that in the smaller jar, 75% of the marbles are blue, and 25% of the marbles are red. The blue marbles are overrepresented. That's the observation. I see that the blue marbles are overrepresented. Now do something about it. You can't do anything about it. You can look at it, but you can't do anything about it. Why? Because in order to do something about it, you have to take marbles out. Or stop putting as many marbles in. That's the language of action. Because now I'm thinking about something that happens to people, not the results of what has happened to people. And there's 2 degrees of freedom, and I can't confuse the two. Because the solutions that go to solving, we let too many in, or we don't let enough out, are 2 different public policy questions. Guided by the same values, but the mechanisms of control that relate to, are we going to let these kids in, or are we going to keep them going through the system at a faster rate? What are the differential rates of admission? What are the differential rates of discharge? That's where we connect to action. And disproportionality keeps us away from the language of action, because it's simply the language of observation. We want to focus on what can we do. It will come down to some very basic ideas. Independent variables and dependent variables. If race is an independent variable, you're answering the question, when I look for it, do I find disparity? That's if black children are treated disparately, they will have bad outcomes. The answer is that's the bad outcome. They stay in foster care longer. Now we want to jump to the explanation. That's not the way science works. You can't have something on the independent variable side and without understanding, well, what predicts the variability in the relationship between admission to foster care in a large urban area versus admission to foster care and the disparities associated in rural areas. So if we have structural explanations, then the disparity goes over on the dependent variable side. We can't jump to the independent. As an independent variable, you can't explain something on the independent variable side of the equation. And one of the technical challenges, the students won't, you'll appreciate the example, but I sent 3 daughters off to college, and there's the question of living expenses. How are we going to manage that? So the first semester, first daughter, sort of like, Dad, you figure out what you need and send Mom and Dad the bill. End of the first semester, it's like, okay, we need to start looking at what you're spending, because our definition of how much is maybe a little bit different than yours. So we're going to start scrutinizing the claimability of your expenses. This happens all the time between government, federal government, state government, and NGOs. Tell me again, what did you spend that money on? Oh, but no. You can't spend money on that. That's not what this program allows. So in the case of the daughters, it's sort of like, okay, we're going to start scrutinizing. You send us before we pay the bill, you've got to send us the credit card statement, and we're going to cross some things off because they're not allowable, right? And then eventually we get to the point where, you know what? We're just going to give you a chunk of money. You figure out how to spend it, but we're not. If you go over, you go over. The risk is yours. But you can spend it on whatever you want, because they're going to come home from that third semester and say, Dad, Mom, we're spending way too much time talking about this. I can't get my studies done because we're reconciling the bills. So if you would just give me the money and let me go, it's like, oh, okay. But if you overspend, don't come. There's a limit. So this is what's going on between government all the time, because it's about risk sharing. How do I control your spending? What's the most effective way to control somebody's spending, particularly in an entitlement program where a legitimate claim cannot be turned down by the government? The government does not want to be exposed to that risk. So how it solves the risk-sharing problem and what it means for whether or not services are fundamentally helpful and in alignment with human rights. It's a big problem. But it's the one that nobody talks about. The Affordable Care Act. Covered population. No, pre-existing conditions are out. We're not covering people with pre-existing conditions. That's the who. The what? Well, we're not going to cover birth control for women, but we will cover Viagra for men. That's the covered services. This is where the debate is. Where you don't hear about in the public press is what the Affordable Care Act will do to fee-for-service health care, which is the contract. It's going to get rid of fee-for-service health care, because fee-for-service health care is a very coercive financial influence on the way people behave because of how it creates system structures to execute the problem. All right, conventional thinking, the GAO and the lack of curiosity. I'm going to sort of speed up here a little bit. In 2007, 2008, the Government Accounting Office, the GAO, issued a report that talked about disproportionality in the experiences of blacks compared to whites. And they said, look at these disparity rates. And they were a little bit all over the place at the state level. The states do not have one disparity rate. There are 50 disparity rates. But they took that information, they went out and talked to experts and asked, well, why do we see these disparities? And the expert said, it's because of poverty. The GAO could have said, well, okay, let's get the state level poverty rates and the state level disparity rates and see if they're correlated. They didn't do that. There are a variety of reasons why they didn't. Part of it has to do with the way the GAO amasses evidence. But it was a general lack of curiosity, not just on the GAO's part, but on the part of people, observers, people who are interested in this question. They said, oh, the GAO said it's poverty, must be poverty. And on we go. And the logic here, you'll see the affirming of the consequent here. Poverty and placement are correlated at a minimum. And if you think about it long enough, it's going to be causal. It's more common in the black community. And so we would expect there to be more placement of kids in out-of-home care in the black communities. And because the disparity measures the differences in utilization, wide gaps in utilization must be linked. That's the thinking. And it is the thinking today among the people who call for disbanding the child welfare system. And this is an extraordinarily naive view of the possibilities, and extraordinarily naive with regard to the structure of empirical argument. I mean, these things, to me, these things matter. There are rules for how you make an argument. It's, you know, it's separating the wheat from the chaff, if you will. So, the conventional thinking is poverty is what's driving disparity rates. Ecological similarity. Structural forces are difficult to observe. So if I were to say, I want everybody in the back of the room and I want you to figure out in the most efficient way possible how to get here to the front of the room in as few steps as possible, your decision making would be constrained by one simple thing, and that is we're all being affected by gravity. Our choices for how to move from the back of the room to the front of the room are constrained by an invisible force. If we think about it long enough, oh yeah, I can't just in a single bound get from the front of the room because gravity is going to sort of be a problem for me in that situation, right? So you don't observe gravity, you observe it through its influence on the observables. And so I'm going to look at this notion of supply-induced demand elasticity. Fancy word. It's convenient because if you take the first letter, you get side, and now you can talk about side effects, and everybody thinks that's clever. But it's a force to in which to contend. How many people have a responsibility for getting clients into services? I know some say. So, is it easier to do when there are services available?
Sure.
As opposed to when there's services? That's supply-induced demand elasticity. When there's capacity, it's easier to get people in. Current example. In this country, we know how many ICU beds there are in every county in the country. I didn't know that. But that's how they're calculating the population level risk of the COVID, because we know that if the COVID numbers get to this level, we no longer have sufficient capacity, and we have to start making clinical decisions about how to withhold services. At the height, in March and April of 2020, a number of outlets were looking at the protocols developed by medical associations at the state level, state health departments, that said, you know, in the event we do not have enough respirators, here's how you decide. Well, this is something that goes on in the child welfare business all the time. In New York City, we were able to determine for every 100 substantiated allegations of child abuse and neglect, this is somebody who went into the home and said, you know what, they're not taking care of that kid very well. We determined they only have 37 slots for preventive services. Now imagine in our situation, you only have 37% of the capacity you need to perform quadruple bypass surgeries that might pop up in your local community. People would be outraged. But we're asking people all the time to make decisions under constraints where the supply of the service and its elasticity relative to demand, it can't be contracted and expanded however you want, and it's affecting decision making. It's tied to utilization and revenue, the point that I was making a little bit earlier about how money is conveyed downstream. It's very closely tied to organizational stability. We were talking about this earlier today. So like the inflow of money, the expansion and contraction of revenue, and its impact on organization and its destabilizing influence has enormous consequences for what an organization is able and willing to do at the end of the day. And the variation in demand is what's at the heart of this. You know, in some states, the number of child abuse and neglect reports in 1 year went up 56%. They did not increase child abuse and neglect prevention services by 56% because the next year it went down by 10%. The volatility in demand, if you're running an organization, is impossible to sort of understand in a rational, let's allocate resources in a way where we minimize the supply effects on demand. So supply effects on demand means I have a supply, you're going to get the service. You get the service because that's what I have. That's what it means when supply induces demand. It's not something that's easily observable because you can't read a case record that a social worker has written where it says, well, we really wanted to get this service for the Jones family, but those services weren't available, so we set them free. That's not what it says in the case record. There will be a justification, but at the end of the day, and in the early part of my career, this was my job, was to figure out how to get people who needed to be in the state hospital or in the short-term inpatient hospital when I knew I couldn't access as many slots as I wanted. And I've got 5 people in the community at varying stages of decomposition. I don't have 5 beds if they all blow up at once. I don't have access to 5 beds. So I've got to figure out not just what the clinical needs are of the patient, I have to figure out which is the one I don't want to be able to hospitalize. All right, I have to hospitalize. Because the consequences for that clinically in relationship to the community are vastly different. Some schizophrenics are easier to manage even though they're off their meds. Other schizophrenics, they got to go to the hospital. And I'm titrating the dose of inpatient hospitalization according to my assessment, not of their clinical needs per se or exclusively, but based on my sense to which, if I needed an extra bed, have I been nice enough to the admitting physician over the last couple of times? Have I done my quid pro quo in terms of managing the fact that we don't have adequate supply? I like to talk about it in terms of the myth of individualized treatment decision. The idea that you come before the system and it's just you going on is too far from the truth at this stage of the game to be tolerated as an explanation for what's going on. So this is just a collection of studies that we're doing. I won't spend time there. Now on to the facts. So the graph at the top on your left, just worry about the shape of the lines in the circle. It's 1970 to 2015. It's the number of poor people below the federal poverty level in the United States by community type. So we have suburbs are blue, cities are red, small metros are yellow, and rural is blue. Rural would be the Huntingtons of the world. You can see that that actually has, in the 70s, that's where most of the poor, quantitatively speaking, that's where most of the poor live. It's been fairly steady. There's migratory patterns. I mean, it's just the numbers, so don't, it's not percentages and what have you. But you can see that there's been a steady march up in poverty in the United States in terms of the numbers. And then in 2000, we see a sharp increase in suburban poverty outside the core urban areas. So that's the face of poverty. We've taken a handful of states, I think probably 16 or 17 states from our database, and we said, okay, let's look at large central, large fringe, medium, small metro, micropolitan, and 9 core. Non-core, basically urban cities, Chicago, LA, down to the most rural parts of America. And let's look at poverty rates now. We're not looking at just the numbers, we're adjusting for the population. You can see here that there's a steady increase in large central areas, bigger increases in large fringe areas, increases in medium areas, small metro, micropolitan, non-care. So the type of the bar, orange, blue to gray, 2000, 2010, 2015. So poverty rates are increasing in all of these places in the United States from 2000 to 2015. This is the number of foster care admissions in this group of states. So interestingly enough, poverty is up in large central areas, but the number of kids coming into out-of-home care in large central cities is going down. Who lives in large urban central cities? Blacks. So foster care population in the places where blacks live are going down. Everywhere else, they're going up. We've been celebrating in this country a decline in the number of kids in out-of-home care. It's back up as a consequence of, you know, the latter part of the last decade, it went back up, but from, well, I guess before the financial crisis to 2014, what have you, the population of kids going into foster care was on its way down. People celebrated that. Oh, you know, we've solved the problem. Oh, it was going down in urban areas, going up in non-urban areas. Right? So this fascination with urban areas is a social problem, has led us to sort of miss some important features of the country that we live in. So we're seeing increase. Now, you know, there are not a lot of kids coming into non-core areas. It's a small number of kids, but you'll see in a moment what these changes actually look like. Median metro, large fringe, everywhere, but not the population is up over this period of time. And as a consequence, foster care is, it used to be 50% of all the kids coming in and out of home care were in this collection of states, were in the large urban areas, and now it's 39%. So, shift. And poverty is up in the places where foster care is growing. That's the thing that I want to pay attention to. This gets at it a little bit more clearly. This is the change in the number of children placed by race, ethnicity. It's, in this case, it's black children and youth, white children and youth, the same corresponding picture of large to rural areas. And you can see here's the, this is also by age. These are the newborns. The blue are the newborns. The infants are 31 days to 365 days of age at the time of their first admission. And then the gray is everybody else, 1 to 17-year-olds. Again, at age at first admission. Not a big number. Almost 300% increase in the number of newborns going into foster care in most rural parts of the country. Not a big number. 300% increase. Increase in newborns everywhere in the white population. Much more pronounced than in the black population. Let that sink in a little bit. I mean, look at it's just a different profile altogether. Now, we're not talking about rates per thousand or any of that stuff. All things that we want to pay attention to, but we want to comprehend the size of the changes that are taking place and what's unique about where it's taking place and how that alters our understanding of the relationship between poverty and the use of foster care. Questions about this? So we're looking now just at the babies, this group of kids who are under the age of 1 year at the time of admission. So now we're going to start. People say to me all the time, you make things too complicated. I say, I'm not making things complicated. I'm trying to figure out how to make your system tractable for people who study it. I'm not making the system complicated. This is what's going on. So I want you to pay attention to 12.1, 9.7, 12.1, 12 babies per 1,000 coming into out-of-home care overall. It's 9.7 for whites, 18.8. Here are the numbers of kids coming in. Here is the child population that we're talking about. And the disparity ratio is 1.93. That's the black rate divided by the white rate, 1.93. So it's almost twice as many kids, 2 times as many kids who on a per capita basis going into out-of-home care who are black as compared to white. So that's the disparity everybody talks about. That, and sure enough, you should talk about that. But to go from this number and say, yeah, that's structural racism. That's just the observation. That yes, there is disparity. Let's see if we can explain it. So here's where it gets complicated. So I'm a quantitative researcher. I think, and I say that only because I'm not really a quantitative researcher. I think that what you have to do is you have to have your ideas expressed, if possible. Expressing them mathematically creates a certain kind of view of the world that is not unimportant. I think it's fair to say that there are very few substantial problems that humankind has solved that weren't solved with the involvement of mathematics. It's just sort of the way it is. And so I'm not saying that what you learn through imposing mathematical structure on observations is the end-all and be-all, but there's something to be learned there. So what I'm concerned here with is the intercept, gamma 0, 0. That's just the rate, and I want to show you how these equations reproduce the raw data, because we're going to use that insight to understand the variability in the disparity rate. So if I have an intercept, then gamma 0, 0 is the white placement rate, gamma 1, 0 is the black placement rate, and if I have no intercept and it's just whites and blacks, I reproduce exactly the numbers from the raw data. And here's what that looks like. Here's gamma 0, 0. What was the event rate overall? 12.1. What was the white rate and what was the black rate? 18.8, 9.7. There's the disparity rate. So I'm reproducing, by imposing these equations on the raw data, I am reproducing what I observed in the raw data. But I'm translating it so that I can use the translation in my analysis. And then down here, with the intercept, the white rate is 9.7, and the difference between the black and white rate is 1.93. So I'm interested in the variability in this number. Here, it's on the right side of the equation. They're the independent variables. If I want to know the rate of admission into foster care, I need to know something about the black rate, and I need to know something about the white rate. There are the independent variables. To explain disparity, it needs to be on the dependent variable side of the model. So, when we do this, so I've taken now the counties and I've organized them in a very crude way, just for purposes of illustration. We have counties where there's high poverty, and that is to say that both the black and the white populations in those counties are poor. What does it mean to be poor? They are 1.5 standard deviations above the average poverty rate for the sample of counties overall. So they are 1.5 standard deviations above the average for both whites and blacks. Separate guideposts for whites and blacks. It's not a single poverty. And the white rate in those places is 27.8. 27.8, that's 2.7% of the kids, babies, going into out-of-home care. 2.7%. The black rate is 18.7. There's actually more white babies going into foster care than black babies in places where the white poverty rate and the black poverty rate are high. Not fewer, more. That's completely counter to the narrative. There are places in this country where there are more white babies going into out-of-home care than black babies in the same state. Where do I see the most disparity? In the places where neither blacks or whites are at the extreme range of poverty. You want to find high rates of disparity? Look in the places where there are no poor people, or relatively speaking. And I don't mean that literally. I mean, in general, look in the counties. So when people, I think I mentioned this to Jim, to you, if people come to me and they say, I'm a black family, I'm really worried about this child welfare thing, what advice would you have for me to avoid involvement with the DCFS system? I would say move to Cook County.
Yeah.
Why? Because there are no poor white people there. And the child welfare system isn't as aggressive there. It's big. There's a lot going on there. It's not to say or deny what's happening, but in relative terms, which is where we need to be on this issue, relatively speaking, in low poverty areas, 2-to-1 placement rate. Look at what happens to the white rate. Well, this is the visualization. So the white placement rate is the solid orange. The black placement rate is the dotted textured bar, and the disparity rate is the shaded bar that lies on top of everything. Notice what happens to the white rate. As poverty goes down, placement rates go down. As poverty is changing, there's not nearly as much change in the black placement rate as you would expect. It's an entirely different relationship The one we talk about, placement and poverty are positively correlated, is true for whites. It is not true for blacks. Counter-narrative. The public rhetoric these days does not align with this set of facts at all. When we go back to explain this, all of the things that are going on, poverty, social disadvantage, so on and so forth, and we want to understand what's the relationship between the changes in poverty, because poverty rates are going up in the non-urban areas, foster care is going up, whites live in the non-urban areas, blacks live in the urban areas, we have these counter trends. What do we make of all of that? This is why the equations are so important, because it allows us to consider all of these factors sort of more or less simultaneously and untangle the narrative in some reasonably easy way to digest. So, point 6 happens to be the placement rate of whites in urban areas. They have low placement rates. Whites in urban areas have low placement rates, where the blacks live. Disparity in urban areas, there's large disparity rates in urban areas as a general matter. 2.7 is the disparity rate, so the 1.93 is just with everything thrown in together. But when we isolate all the factors, it's actually 2.7. So it's in some respects even worse. We're looking then at, well, what was your placement rate in 2000? How did the placement rate you had in 2000 relate to the change in placement rates going forward in time? So it doesn't look like a lot, but the higher the time one placement rate is, the sharper the increase. So if you already had a high placement rate, the increase in your placement rate was even stronger. The cohort, so 2000, 2010, 2015, didn't have a lot to say. Black poverty. Black poverty increases white placement rates. White poverty really increases placement rates. So in a county that has high levels of black poverty, there's going to be, the ratio of the two rates is going to be about 50% higher. If it's black poverty, it's 96% higher. It's just, I mean, there's no comparison. When we look at the interaction, where black poverty rates are high, poverty disparity tends to be larger. But where white poverty rates are high, disparity tends to be much smaller. So where there are poor whites, the experience in relationship to the foster care system will be more similar, not less similar, more similar. Disparity goes down in places where white poverty rates are high. The delta black poverty, this is the change in the black poverty rate over this 3-year period of time. Changes in black poverty produce modest changes in white placement rates. Changes in white poverty produces substantial changes in white placement rates. And then changes in black poverty pushes disparity up, but it's counteracted by changes in white poverty, which pulls disparity down. So there's a dynamic tension here going on between black poverty and white poverty, and how the systems are responding to each situation. This actually should be non-urban. Non-urban areas have higher placement rates. We saw that. And disparity in non-urban areas is smaller, indicated by anything over one is more, anything under 1 is less. So in non-urban areas, they have much higher placement rates today than they used to. And the disparity in non-urban areas is small because of this dynamic around white poverty and related issues. So it's a different story. So very quickly, what's the structural explanation for disparity, supply-induced demand? I think that's where we need to look for structures within the system that are of our own creation, where we might have a chance to do something about it. So to do that, we look at 520 weeks of weekly admissions and discharges. So every week, kids are coming in. It's a big transaction. Kids are coming in, kids are going out. If there is supply-induced demand, our theory is that the admissions and discharges will move together. That if I let kids out this week, next week I've got to let a bunch of kids in. If I don't let anybody in, I'm not going to let anybody out. So there's the dance that's taking place between emissions. And this is the population biology version of birth processes and death processes. That the carrying capacity of the environment has an influence on the birth process and the death process in natural populations. And so to give you an idea here is, this is the entry on day 1. These are the entries 7 days ago, and these are the entries 14 days ago. So we lag the counts of admissions every 7. Then we move 1 day, and it's day 2, day 8, day 15. Then it's day 3, day 9, and then we plot that, and this is an illustration of an admission and discharge processes that have no relationship to one another, because the next point in the plot can be anywhere here. It's random. And when you look at the time series of weekly admissions, you would go, well, that's random. It's not random. It only looks random because of how you're looking at the data. And this is so in physics, this would be called a three-dimensional phase portrait. And so we're interested in these phase plots. So what does it really look like? Watch how they move together. This is the dance. They occupy the same region. Even though the numbers are going down, they dance together. And that is because there is a constraint operating on them. The carrying capacity of the system is regulating the ins and outs. And it's doing that because the organizations that provide these services are managing to a utilization target. That's the explanation. That's the behavioral version of what's going on. So, we're going to use supply-induced demand to try and explain disparity. So, do we expect disparity to be the same in each state? It's the same question. This is the between-state variability in the likelihood that a child will experience congregate care. Nobody likes congregate care. We'd like to eliminate it altogether. This is what it looks like from a state variation perspective. Between states. So it ranges from a low of roughly 28% all the way out to 70%. 70% of the kids that are admitted into out-of-home care, I think these are teenagers because that's the risk population, 70% of them will experience congregate care, group care, institutional, residential treatment, what have you. And then there are states that it's only 28%. So whether you experience residential care in this country depends on where you live. So let's take the state with the most utilization of congregate care and look at the county level. This is the within-state variation that induces demand. Whites don't. Why? Because it's largely an urban phenomenon. And we already know there are no poor whites in the urban areas. They live in the rural areas. But supply-induced demand is weakest in the rural areas because anybody setting up a business to run group homes is not doing it in rural areas. Why? Because the supply of kids needed to meet their revenue targets doesn't exist. It's too unreliable. So you don't set them up there. The rural people, rural communities, send their kids to urban areas when they need a group home. So when we take this into account, the differences disappear. This is more of the same. We don't need. This just breaks it out by urban, whether or not there's supply-induced demand, white females, and then we do various statistical manipulations. This says the same thing. This is when we do the most thorough job of controlling for all of the things that contaminate your view of what's going on, and you can see that. The height of the bar above the red line is the size of the difference between the black experience and the white experience. So when we do the best job we can, controlling for context, age, etc., urbanicity, the disparities don't go away entirely. But you can see that understanding the ecological similarity, understanding if we look at people who live in the same circumstances, that's how we want to see what the differences are, because it could be segregation that's underlying, in which case the child welfare system will have a hard time solving the segregation problem. Not out of the question, So what's the structural mechanism, how we pay? We've already talked about this. Foster care is largely in the hands of not-for-profit agencies. The government does not get involved in direct care as much as it used to. There are isolated pockets in the country. These agencies have fixed and variable costs. And service quality depends on stability. Again, we talked about this before. You know, you want these kids to get good services. Guess what? You need trained staff. And if one year you're providing 100,000 days of care, and the next year you're providing 200,000 days, and the year after that you're providing 80,000 days, good luck holding on to your staff. It's not going to work. And so stability depends on revenue stability. And revenue is paid for on providing the actual service. You don't provide the service, you don't get the money. So you have to lean into utilization. It's not the sole determinant, but you're leaning into it. You're looking for ways to justify what's going on because you're trying to manage the equilibrium between revenue and your target revenue. And this is what's detected in the dance between admissions and discharges. So we have good evidence. Now we get to the interesting part. How much time do I have? Not a lot. So we did a case study. We said, okay, let's look at all this stuff. And you'll notice over here, so we have a large urban county, and we have a group of 8 counties, and then a subset of the 8 in 3 counties. What's unique about the 8 counties? In the 8 counties, the black rate of entry is larger than the black rate of entry in the large urban area. So they're placing more black kids in this place than they are in the large urban area. The 3 counties, what's unique about them is that they're placing more white babies than black babies in the urban area. More white babies, 50% more white babies. Now you just think about that. On a per capita basis, if you're placing 35 babies per thousand, and or 49 babies per thousand and 21 per thousand whites, the size of the workforce needed to do that much work. Right? Just it takes time to place kids in out-of-home care. There's court work, there's casework, there's collateral visits, the list of things that go into. We did a workload study. How much time does it take to get a kid into foster care having been? We had to come up with 2,000 questions in order to disassemble the tasks involved in managing a child abuse and neglect investigation. 2,000 questions because of all of the intricacies. So the workforce allocated to this community is dramatically different than the workforce allocated to that community. Has to be. You can't do this much work with the same workforce as you have in that group. It's just not possible. So, but look at the within county disparity. So here's what we found: 7.8. Right, that's the urban area. But as we increase white poverty, 8, 12, 14. This is a 75% increase in white poverty and a 10% increase in black poverty. So there's a much bigger increase in this point in time view. And the within county disparity goes from 7.8, 3.1, 2.3. That's the main statistical finding. But look at the between county variability. The C to A ratio, 21 to 1.8. Where the white poverty rate goes up by 75%, the placement rate goes up by 11.8. It's a huge jump. It's only 3.5 for the blacks. So there's an increase in the black poverty rate of roughly 10%. It goes up by a factor of 3.5. There's a 6%, but ultimately 75% increase in the white poverty rate, and it jumps 11 times. It's a huge increase. So this is the responsiveness of the system to black poverty, or I'm sorry, white poverty. So interestingly enough, let's monetize. Money is the best measure of inequality. In the large urban county, there's the data. They spend $1 million per 1,000 kids for foster care. In the 3 counties where the white placement rate exceeds the black placement rate, they are spending $2.9 million per thousand. The child saving effort in the places where there is white poverty is 3 times the size of the black child saving investment in a place where blacks live in segregated neighborhoods. I don't know the answer to the question just yet, but what it tells me is that we are more willing to save white babies from the impoverishment of their parents than we are willing to save black babies if the blacks happen to be living in segregated urban areas. Now, I don't know that this is one case study. I don't know how it plays out in other places. This is not inconsistent with the overarching narrative of you want to see where the child welfare system is responsive to poverty, look in the places where there's white poverty, not black poverty. So the narrative that, well, the reason why we have so much disparity is because blacks are so much more likely to be poor. That's actually not the case. It appears to be more likely. Now, there are all kinds of things that you can look at this and say, well, you didn't think about this, you didn't think about that. But true enough. All I'm trying to do is say, I just took what people are using as the narrative and just asking the question, well, does some simple data substantiate those claims? I'm not saying that there isn't more to learn about this, or that because counties are not a good representation of the heterogeneity that is embedded in counties. You know, Cook County includes some of Chicago, but there's other parts of Cook County that aren't in Chicago. And they tend to be white, and so there's a lot that you could do. But this just raises the question: why are we so locked into this narrative that the surveillance in black communities is so much greater than the surveillance in white communities? It is if the white communities are rich, but if the white communities are poor, doesn't appear to me at this stage in the game that that's at all the case. But yet it's the narrative. So they've affirmed the consequence. They didn't actually do the work of saying, okay, we see there is disparity, 1.93. Now I want to know, is that 1.93 the number in all 3,000 counties in the United States? Or is it possible that there's some variability around the 1.93? And is there any possibility that there's significant variability around that average? And how is the variability around that average related in any way, shape, or form to structural explanations, like the fact that we pay for service? The only way you can increase this to $2.9 million per thousand, I mean, there are ways you can do it through preventive services, but the easiest way to do it would be just place more black kids. And in terms of community investment, if you decided that these numbers were too high, say goodbye to the $2.9 million, because you're no longer paying for foster care, the money goes away. So if you reduce foster care, you're disinvesting in communities, and you can't invest in communities because in order to do it at this scale, you got to put kids in out-of-home care. That's a structural problem. And the nice thing about it is, if we can call it that, is that this is a human-created problem. This is not some feature of the natural system over which we have very little control, like gravity. But this is something we can actually do something about. We can decide we're not going to pay for things that way anymore. We're going to pay for things in a different way. Money happens to be the third rail of politics, because people want to spend more, people want to spend less. But at the end of the day, the inequities, it seems to me, are somewhere hidden in these disparities in cash outlays for purposes of child saving. And it strikes me that we might be more willing to do it where poor whites are involved. And we have to, we can't ignore, but whether we make a relatively speaking, I mean, go back to this number here. 14% poverty rate gets you 21 per thousand placements. Now, it's not everywhere. It's only 11.4. 12% poverty. But if this was the placement rate, you know, the ratio was the same, the number of black kids going into out-of-home care would just be way bigger than it is. And placement does represent a commitment of public resources. we don't have to like it, we just have to recognize that, yeah, that's what we're doing. We're spending money. We're finding homes for these kids, because somewhere we've made the judgment that that's not, and to those of you who are thinking about, well, what about Native Americans in Canada and Australia and the stolen generation and so forth? This doesn't negate that narrative. It just simply says there may be more than one narrative that speaks to how the dominant society tries to manage the problem of raising the next generation of children in the face of diverse forms of family, diverse economic circumstances, diverse lived experience, what have you, that there isn't just one way in which we find ways to express discrimination. Why does it have to be just one thing? Why can't it be many things? And aren't we under an obligation as citizens, but then from my perspective as a scientist, aren't we obligated to understand the varieties in which this bias, discrimination, however you want to call it, expresses itself? Isn't that our obligation? So I'll stop there, and we don't have a lot of time, but I'm happy to stay and take questions. I know it's late, but have at it if you're so moved. But thank you very much.